All right, good morning. Let's get started. All right, there are times that as a church, we have to stop and consider what is going on in our world, to consider it from a biblical perspective, because I know in many churches they have a tendency that when certain things are going on, they almost act like they're not happening, and I've never really understood how pastors can operate that way, because they just come and then preach as if whatever is going on, it should just not be spoken of, and then you just speak about it, I guess, in between services. But I think there are times the church has to stop whatever we're currently doing and do a special study to look at a situation from a biblical perspective, because whether you know this or not, thinking biblically is not the natural way, correct? Can we all agree with that? We don't just start off thinking biblically, and as a Christian, just because you become a Christian, and just because you show up at church, and just because you own a Bible, doesn't mean you're going to think biblically about what's happening in the world. That's just a fact. The only way that's going to occur is when you stop to think about what's happening and then consider it from a biblical perspective. Let's just start this morning with a couple of passages. Go to Romans chapter 12. Look at three passages really quick. We got a lot to cover in an hour. Don't know if we're going to pull this off. Romans chapter 12. I'm going to do my best. We all know this passage, very well-known passage. Romans chapter 12. We'll start in verse 1. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Okay, that's about presenting our bodies. It's our spiritual act of worship. But then in verse 2, it tells us not to be conformed to this world. Don't be conformed. Conformity to this world is not what a Christian strives for. We strive for conformity to something else. But the way we're not going to be conformed to this world is by what? We are to be transformed by the renewing of the mind. And what is the result of our renewed mind? That we can do what? That we can prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. It is through the transformation or the renewing of a mind that we can literally prove and understand what the will of God is. We can understand something from God's perspective. We can understand it from a biblical perspective. But it requires the renewing of the mind. And we believe the renewing of the mind occurs through what? Through the study of this. The study of God's Word is how it renews our mind. So, in other words, something has to happen. You just don't naturally wake up one day and go, oh, I can see everything from a biblical perspective. If you listen to Christians talk, constantly you're like, wait a minute, that's not biblical. Wait, that's not biblical. Because we don't naturally think that way. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Second Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. Everyone there? All right, 2 Corinthians 10:5. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Every thought that comes into our mind, we are to take it captive and bring it into obedience or bring it into submission. In other words, how we think has to be taken into captivity, and then we bring it into submission to the right way of thinking, and the right way of thinking is a biblical way of thinking. But that requires a process, right? Yes, there's something you have to do. It's a process. It's an effort. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. This will be the last passage of Scripture, 1 Corinthians chapter 2. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16 says this, for who hath known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? But we have what? But we have the mind of Christ. Now, we don't have the mind of Christ before salvation. After salvation, we are supposed to have the mind of Christ. We are supposed to think that way. And to have the mind of Christ, one commentary states it this way. Having the mind of Christ means sharing the plan, purpose, and perspective of Christ. We share the same perspective. We think the same way. And again, that doesn't naturally happen. It has to be developed. You have to constantly test the way you think. And sadly, what many Christians do, they come to church, they hear a sermon, they may read the Bible during the week, and then when they see what's happening in the world and they speak, they're speaking about what's going on in the world doesn't reflect a biblical perspective. It's something else is influencing it. And we could ask ourselves why. I think, one, most Christians are never challenged to do that. I think the church is the place when Christians arrive, if there's something happening in the world significantly, that the church needs to stop and go, okay, guys, here's what's happening. Let's think about it biblically. But pastors are afraid to do that. And I understand why. Because if you're talking about what's happening in the world, you're going to have a lot of people sitting there who may not be thinking about it biblically, and to challenge them to think about it biblically may go against the way they currently think, which then turns into controversy, and then everyone gets upset. So you usually just let's just not pretend. Let's pretend that we don't know what's happening in the world. But to do that means you've got Christians running around not thinking from a biblical perspective. So this morning, I'm going to do my best to challenge us to think biblically, theologically, about an important situation that has been talked about all week, and we're going to talk about it right now. All right? Now, this has the potential of being controversial. I guarantee you, before I get back here this evening, I'll already have emails with people saying who knows what about me. But I can't allow that to stop me, correct? And you may disagree with everything, but I can't allow that to stop me, because we have to try to look at the situation from a biblical perspective. All right, so we'll start with the news, and then we're going to look at what has happened. We're going to look at the possible consequences of what has happened. We're going to look at the absolute most breaking news that occurred just literally 30 minutes ago, maybe. And then we're going to then stop and go, okay, what are the different ways we can look at this? And then what is the correct way to look at it, all right? So we're going to work through this carefully. Most everyone here probably knows that the United States of America launched a drone attack, killing one of the top generals of Iran, right? Some would call it a targeted assassination. If you don't know the name of the general, Qassem Soleimani, he was one of the most powerful men in Iran. And some would refer to this killing as a drastic escalation of already a dangerous situation in the Middle East, threatening to trigger violence from the Gulf to the shores of the Mediterranean. The Pentagon announced the U.S. had carried out the attack near Baghdad airport, describing it as a decisive defensive action to protect U.S. personnel abroad. In a statement late Thursday, the Pentagon asserted that General Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. It said Soleimani had orchestrated attacks on coalition bases in Iraq over the last several months. The targeted U.S. drone strike also killed one of the most prominent leaders of the Iraq Shia militia, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. Al-Mohandes was the leader of a branch of Hezbollah. I think it's Katab Hezbollah, I think is how you say it. An Iran-backed group that Washington blames for a recent surge in rocket attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq. Hundreds of the group's supporters attacked the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad this week, following U.S. airstrikes against 5 of Kata'ib Hezbollah's units in Iraq and Syria last Friday. The latest crisis has been brewing for weeks amid an uptick in rocket attacks by Shia militia against Iraqi bases where U.S. forces are present. Attacks of growing sophistication and accuracy in which U.S. civilian contractors has been killed. Now, one of the Charles Lester, a leading analyst of Iranian policy in the region, says this strike far eclipsed the deaths of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. Right? It goes even beyond that. This is how big this is. Also, it's bigger than the killing of ISIS founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, if I can say his name right. in terms of strategic significance and implication. So this is bigger, according to this analyst, than the killing of Osama bin Laden and the founder of ISIS. That's how big this is. And I think the average person may not even realize how big the situation is. The U.S. and Iran have been engaged in a dangerous tit-for-tat for months. This is a massive walk-up of the escalation ladder, this expert said. The U.S. Drone strike killed the commander of Iran's Quds force at Baghdad International Airport on January the 3rd, 2019. Now, please note, you have a general from Iran who we take out in Iraq without permission of the Iraqi government, right? Targeted assassination is the only way to describe this. If you don't know anything about Soleimani, I mean, you talk about basically a hero in that region, and so we've basically turned him into a martyr, and which is going to have serious implications. I got all kinds of information here that goes on for pages. And let's just say people in the area are mad. I posted a picture yesterday inside of Iran. They ran up the red flag, which basically is a sign that war is to come. That they're going to go do whatever is necessary to kill as many Americans as possible because of this. Just to look at some recent headlines, Iran launches cyber attacks on U.S. government website. They will punish Americans wherever they are. They threaten to attack the White House. They condemn Trump as a terrorist in a suit. Soleimani's body is taken on unprecedented public mourning tour. Chance of death to America. Another general has obviously already been appointed and will come out. So taking one out, we'll get into that. Fear hits Tehran over what might come next. Britain must be ready for looming war. Could America restart the draft? Protest across the nation. And there are doubts at the Pentagon about what's going on and what even the policy is and what we're doing and why we did it. Rage builds. Iran eyes 35 targets. Rockets launched at U.S. troops. And then just this morning, breaking, the Iraqi parliament has voted to expel the U.S. from the country. We've been voted to be kicked out of Iraq. And you may not think that's a big deal, but if we're going to be in a war with Iran, we kind of need a place to stage troops and to launch attacks. So that could have all kinds of strategic implications. Now, we could talk here. Another article states it this way. What happened was a political assassination. Said the U.S. strike that targeted Iran's elite Quds Force commander, Qassem Soleimani, as he traveled in a convoy near the Baghdad airport, was a political assassination. And there's a number of reports talking about that. So that's the basic thing. There's news article after news article after news article. I can't even keep up with all the things that are happening, all the developments. I'm trying to go through that as quickly as possible. I didn't even read everything that I have because I could spend 3 hours just explaining what happened. So simply put, we take out at least 2 leaders, and then other people were killed as well in the drone attack. All right, it happened in Iraq. We take out an Iranian leader, and now everyone in the region is, to say upset would be an understatement. There's threats of escalation, and will this lead to a regional war or even spread? Those are the questions. Now, that's what happened. Now, that is a simple summary of what happened. I mean, I want to go into more detail, but I can't for time. That's the simple statement of what has occurred. Now, as Christians, we have to ask ourselves, how do we look at this? All right? So there's a couple of ways we can look at it. So let's go with our possible ways of looking at it. You ready? Number 1, we can look at it from a legal perspective. We can look at it from a legal perspective. Was it even legal for this to occur? Well, let me give you some, I looked up a lot of information here, so I've got a lot here. I'm going to try to read as much of this as possible. I'll go as quickly as I can. President Donald Trump's decision to carry out a lethal targeted strike against an Iranian general, widely said to have American blood on his hands, has renewed an international legal debate about the line between warfare and assassination that has never fully been resolved. The U.S. government justified the strike as an act of self-defense, saying that Qassem Soleimani, the leader of an elite Iranian military and intelligence unit, had been plotting attacks on Americans. An allegation that few analysts seriously doubt, given his track record as the architect of Iranian attacks abroad. Brian Hook, the Department of State's special representative for Iran, told a television network on Friday that Soleimani was planning an attack on U.S. faculties and workers in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria that would have killed hundreds of Americans. But the United Nations official in charge of examining targeted killings questioned the operation in a series of tweets, noting that the U.S. did not detail any specific plot involving Soleimani. Under international human rights law, she noted, a country may kill in self-defense only under extremely narrow circumstances in which the lethal strike was the only option to prevent the imminent attack. She also argued that the deaths of those killed as collateral damage, including drivers and security guards, was unlawful. Iraq's public objection to the strike in Baghdad also means it violates international law, other scholars argue. We have carried out the attack in the territory of a state that plainly did not give us permission, said Mary Ellen O'Connell, a law professor and an expert on international disputes at the University of Notre Dame. The attack was unlawful. The assassination was not justifiable. The U.S. government doesn't see it that way and hasn't for a long time under both Democratic and Republican administrations. The U.S. government does not believe it is bound by human rights law and treaties via our operations overseas, says Bobby Chesney, and he's at the University of Texas in Austin, and he's the chair dealing with law and world affairs. The targeted attack on Soleimani, Chesney said, resembles a World War II strike on a Japanese admiral who was the architect of Pearl Harbor. All right, and that operation was called it was codenamed Operation Vengeance when we took out a Japanese admiral. While the U.S. technically is not at war with Iran, it appears to be in a state of armed conflict, meaning the strike can be viewed through the lens of the international laws of war. In that case, the killing of a military commander is justified, and the deaths of his bodyguards and drivers are not as illegal as long as the strike was proportional, meaning using only the amount of force necessary to achieve the objective. While Iraq has protested that it did not grant permission for the strike within its territory, the U.S. can argue that once invited in by Iraq, the U.S. military has the right to defend itself from threats. But that view may not settle the matter, according to Scott Anderson, a former State Department advisor who is now a fellow at the Brookings Institution. The U.S. decision to directly target Iranian affiliates within Iraq without the permission of Congress or the Iraqi government raises a number of direct legal and policy questions, he wrote this week. As a legal matter, the airstrikes are consistent with measures the United States claims the legal authority to pursue in defense of its personnel under both domestic and international law. Yet the conclusion relies on certain interpretations of international law and related facts that Iraqis are almost certain to reject, contributing to the view that U.S. actions violated Iraq's sovereignty. The U.S. did not always view targeted killings this way as it does now. Just 2 months before the terrorist attacks of September the 11th, 2001, America officials forcefully rejected their position condemning missile strikes by Israelis targeting specific Palestinian militants. We used to condemn these kinds of things. Now we support and carry out these kinds of things. The United States government is very clear on a record as against targeted assassinations, the U.S. ambassador to Israel said at the time. They are killings, and we do not support that. They're extrajudicial killings, and we do not support that. But after the towers fell, we all know what changed. Under Obama, the United States carried out more than 500 strikes that killed thousands of people, according to an independent group that tracked the strikes. And while the drone war against al-Qaeda drew international condemnation, the consensus among U.S. legal experts was that it was appropriate for the U.S. to hunt and kill terrorists who were plotting attacks on Americans, not only in the ungoverned spaces and war zones such as Afghanistan and Iraq, but also in sovereign countries such as Pakistan and Libya. So we can look at it from a legal perspective, and guess what we find? Lots of different points of views, a lot of disagreements on whether it's legal or not legal. But remember, legality, now this is very important, all right? And those are all the news articles I'm going to have. Now we can really just dig in. So let's go ahead and deal with this. So what's the first way we can look at this situation? Legally. All right, let's make a very important point from a Christian perspective. Does legality equal morality? Absolutely not, because is abortion legal? Do you believe it's moral? All right, so therefore you can't make an argument that something is legal, therefore it's moral. Christians don't just look at it from a legal perspective. We have to go beyond that. However, just so that you know, when you hear people debating this, there doesn't seem to be a consensus on whether it was legal or whether it was illegal, but it's definitely raising a lot of questions. I know this, the Iraqi parliament just kicked us out and just voted to kick us out of the country, so they definitely didn't agree with it. Okay, which raises lots of questions. And then, well, we could go into why we were even there, but that's a whole different matter. So, from a legal perspective, there doesn't seem to be consensus. But from a Christian perspective, we want to go beyond just the legality of something. All right? So far, so good. What's the second way we can look at it? Politically. We can look at it politically. And guess how we look at it politically? If your team's in power, it's okay. If your team's not in power, it's not okay. Okay? So, that's the political thing. You know my feelings about politics. Christians should not be Christianity should never have been hijacked by politics. However, it has been. The church allowed it to happen, and you need to eradicate and you need to just destroy and remove that way of thinking. The Christian way of thinking is not politically controlled. Christianity is not a political movement. Christianity transcends politics. It's not supposed to be that way. And what we've allowed to happen is, hey, I'm a Christian, but my political thinking comes before my Christianity. No. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Does the Bible say to have your mind renewed by politics? Does it say to conform your way of thinking to politics? No. But that has so infiltrated the church that we can't. Now, we can look at it politically, and it's going to be simple. If you're a Trump supporter, then it's the greatest decision in the history of mankind. If you're not a Trump supporter, it's the worst decision in the history of mankind. It's not supposed to work that way. Right? It's not supposed to work that way. There's got to be a greater way of thinking. So there's the political. What's the third way to look at it? Well, strategically. We can look at it from a strategic argument. Okay, what was the strategic advantage of killing one of the top beloved generals of Iran, turning him into a martyr, and creating utter and complete chaos in the Middle East, and now everything is beginning to spiral out of control? Well, the U.S. government is arguing, well, he was planning an attack. They haven't told us what attack, haven't given us any evidence of said attack, but he was going to carry out an attack. Well, strategically, I would argue, generals don't carry out the attacks. Generals only plan. And if the plan was already in place, you can remove one general, and guess what? The plan can still go into effect. So, and whatever he was planning, now Iran is planning far more than what he was planning. So you only escalated, you didn't de-escalate, you escalated the situation, and I don't know what we accomplished. And again, I'm always going to be skeptical, and I know I tick off a lot of Christians when I say this. I don't care that the government said they were planning attacks. Our government also told us there were weapons of mass destruction to cause us to invade a country and lead to the death of almost 1 million people, which there were no weapons of mass destruction. And I was on record on the internet saying there would be no weapons of mass destruction there. I told everyone there would be no weapons of mass destruction. I told everyone we should not go to a war in Iraq because I knew there were no weapons of mass destruction there because it's the most ludicrous claim I've ever heard in my entire life. So just because we claim something doesn't necessarily mean it is true. So we have every right to question the strategy. All right, we have every right to say, what's the strategy here? Right? What's the strategic play? We kill a general, we tick off everyone, and now we're getting voted to leave Iraq. What was the strategy? Now that's a question you have to ask yourself. What's the strategy? You have to read and say, what's the strategy? I don't know what the strategy is. I don't even understand it from a strategic standpoint. And I've yet to hear anyone articulate a good strategic reason for doing so other than, well, he was going to do bad things to us. Okay, well, that's not a strategy. Right? Because strategy means if I do this, in strategy, you're playing chess. If I move this and they move here, then I'll move. You've got to be thinking 4, 5, 6 steps ahead. So strategically, I don't understand it. But that's one way to look at it. What's another way to look at it? Now, this is going to get me in so much trouble here, but that's okay. Okay? Nationalism. Nationalism. Oh, boy. I'm about to get in trouble. All right. Does everybody know what nationalism is? Can anyone give me a good definition of nationalism? There we go. Okay. Nationalism, identification with one's own nation and support for its interest, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interest of other nations. Nationalism was the thing that got Donald Trump elected in 2016. He brought a nationalistic message. What's his slogan? America first, make America great again. And millions of Americans yes, they bought into nationalism. Many Christians bought into nationalism. All right? Nationalism. I will make an argument nationalism and Christianity are not the same thing, should never be equated, and for Christians to elevate nationalism is shocking to me that Christians would ever bought into the message, but the Christians did. I mean, obviously, he got elected because of Christians. So nationalism is a way to look at it. And again, what's nationalism? What do you care about? Your interest at the detriment to all others. The only thing that matters to you is what? America. That's not a Christian perspective. The Christian perspective is not America first. Now, this is what always gets Pope Francis in trouble because Pope Francis definitely does not hold to nationalism. And whenever he says something, then all the Christians come out, he's a socialist, communist, no good heretic. Or he's trying not to look at it from a nationalistic perspective. And that seems foreign to the American Christian. American Christian, I mean, sometimes you'll see people on social media who'll post something, it'll be like a Bible, an American flag, and a gun. Yeah! No. That's not quite the way Christianity works, right? But there's a nationalistic approach. Now, every individual who lives inside a country may have, now not all people in a country think in a nationalistic way, but there's a large portion of every population who nationalism is very appealing to their viewpoint, right? A lot of people in every country are very nationalistic. I've never been nationalistic, but most people are. So I can understand that there is a built-in, it's like it never makes sense to me, but this is the way it works. If you go to a specific school, then you're supposed to root and cheer for your school. I never understand that. It makes no sense to me. If I live in a state, then I'm supposed to cheer for the teams of that state, right? I'm pro that state. I'm pro that school because just somehow there was a consent. Someone got together and said, this is what you're supposed to do. If you go to this school, you're pro this school. If you live in this state, you're pro this state. You live in this country, you're pro this country. And like there's just, someone just came along and sent out a memo to everyone, and everyone's like, yep, that's what I'm supposed to do. Some people are like, no, don't have to follow the memo, right? So there's a natural built-in thing to be drawn to nationalism. What I am going to argue is Christianity does not conform to that rule. Does that make sense? In fact, what did some of the prophets get in trouble for? Not being nationalistic. They felt like that they were speaking against their country and that they weren't supporting their country. And because God's message is not pro-America. Does that make sense? It's not. Now, you may want to argue that it is, but find me the verse that says pro-America. You're not going to know it's not there. America didn't even exist. Right? Now, we can argue that as a Christian, it should make you a better citizen, but your allegiance is not to a flag. That's why some Christians have argued we shouldn't even pledge allegiance to the flag because our allegiance is not to a flag. Our allegiance is not to a country. Where is our allegiance to? To God. Now, I believe you can serve God and serve the country in a correct way, but what's your allegiance ultimately to? To God. It always has to be God first. Does that make sense? Has to be. Now that, and again, I'm going to get people emailing me saying I'm not patriotic and I'm blah, 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 but I wore the uniform for the United States military for 19 years of my adult life, so they can go email someone else and leave me alone. But I'll get being told that I'm a communist or a socialist, who knows what. But I just want you to understand, now there's been a big, just type in Trump, nationalism, Christianity. There's millions of articles out there with lost people going, what is Christians doing? Like, I think even lost people are confused by the Christians' adaptation, like, nationalism, that's our religion. And I think the lost people are like, I thought your religion was Jesus and the Bible and God and morality and theology. What happened? You replaced the Bible for a red hat. That's how sometimes the world looks at it. Look, what happened? Nationalism is a way that you can look at it. And what would be the nationalism way of looking at this? Well, America did it, so it's right. America did it. It's good. Right? That's not true. Okay, again, America invaded Iraq under false pretense that led to the possible killing of 1 million people. No, I don't think that's good. I think that's wrong. I think it was I think the war. Yeah, don't even get me started on my feel. I won't even be able to say my feelings there because I'll get myself in trouble. I believe some people should have been brought up on war crimes, but we won't go there. All right. So that gives us all the different ways of looking at it. We got one left, but that's the one we're working towards. But let's go through them again. What's the first way we can look at it? Legally. And if we look at it from a legal perspective, I just gave you an article that gave you I don't know how many different opinions. And is there a consensus? No. But what must we remember from a Christian perspective? Legality does not equal does not equal morality. That is a very important principle. Right? What was the second way we can look at it? Politically. And how does that usually play out? Party in charge. If it's your team, good. If it's not your team, bad. Like, for example, there are many liberals who will condemn what Trump just did, but they didn't condemn Obama launching 500 drone strikes. I mean, he carried out more drone strikes, I think, than all the presidents combined. I mean, he was, but it never really got the media attention. Right? Trump does it, gets the media attention. Why? Because the media is not in favor of Trump. The issue is, it doesn't matter which party carried out the strikes. Are the strikes right? Are the strikes wrong? Like, you got to look at it from a different perspective, right? What's the next way to look at it? Strategically. I don't get the strategy. I don't understand the strategy. Makes no sense to me, but okay. To me, it's only created bigger problems. It seems like a poorly planned out strategy. Does that make sense? But yeah, you can have a difference in opinion on strategy. Here's what we'll know. We'll know soon enough if it was strategically good or strategically bad, right? Time will prove that out. All right, next, using nationalism, all right? And again, nationalism is not a Christian perspective. I know I'll get people arguing with me. You have lots of people. I'll just give one example. I don't agree with him on pretty much, I disagree with him on a lot of things. Alex Jones has a major, he has a large following within the Christian world. And, you know, he's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but he definitely promotes a Christian nationalism. He mixes in Jesus and Christianity into his message while he's throwing out all kinds of obscenities. But Alex Jones, you know, conspiracy theorist, says lots of things. Now, he gets a lot of things right, and he says lots of interesting information, but he merges a nationalistic, pro-nationalism Christian message. And a lot of Christians who listen to Alex Jones and people like him then buy into a Christian nationalism, right? You know, we're a Christian country, America first, America's great because America's Christian and we do everything right. And it's like, whoa, slow down. It's almost a merging of what two things? Church and state. And, well, as Baptists, we should be against it. Our history says we're against it. But what always happens in history when you merge the two? What do I always say? Merge church and state, people die. Merge church and state, people die. People start losing their rights and bad things happen. I mean, church history, no one can argue with, anyone who studies church history knows that's what happens. All right. So that leads us to the last way to look at it. Only one way left. What's this way? The just war doctrine. The just war doctrine or just war theory. Now, we give it this name, but we make sure you understand this. The just war doctrine or just war theory is simply an attempt to try to look at the subject of war from a biblical and theological perspective. So what is the just war doctrine? It is an attempt to look at the subject of war from a biblical and theological perspective. Now, you have to draw a distinction between Christian just war theory and other just war theories. Some will argue that just war theory began all the way back in ancient Egypt. There's been lots of different schools of thought for just war theory, just war view, but we are going to speak of the Christian just war theory, and we're going to talk about that and try to establish this way of thinking, which is not common, I say, within the church, all right? I'm going to give you some basic information here, and we'll see how far we can go, all right? Everybody ready? Just war theory is a doctrine, also referred to as a tradition of military ethics, studied by military leaders, theologians, and policymakers. The purpose of the doctrine is to ensure war is morally justifiable through a series of criteria, all of which must be met for a war to be considered just. All right, let's go through that again. Just war theory is a doctrine. It's also referred to as what? A tradition of military ethics. It is studied by whom? Military leaders, theologians, policymakers. What is the purpose of the doctrine? To ensure war is what? Morally justifiable. And how is this done? Through a series of criteria, all of which must be met for a war to be considered just. Everybody got that? So what is just war theory? A doctrine. It's also referred to as a tradition of military ethics. Who is it studied by? Military leaders, theologians, policy makers, right? What is the purpose of the doctrine? To ensure war is morally justifiable. And how is it done? Through a series of criteria, all of which must be met for a war to be considered just. All right? That is taking it out of what realm? That's not looking at it from a legal perspective. It's not looking at it from a political perspective. It's not looking at it from a nationalistic perspective. How is it looking at it? From a war? What's the key thing here? What's the key word here to say the way you're looking at it? You're trying to determine if the war is just or morally, but is it just? That's the key. Is it just? Now, think about it, right? Let's go back. Vietnam, just or unjust? The Korean conflict. The first Gulf War. The second war with Iraq. The war in Afghanistan. Now, you get average Christians and you'll get, who knows, you'll hear all kinds of crazy things, and sometimes I'm just like, what are Christians talking about? And sadly, it's usually Christian men who say some of the absolutely outrageous, foolish things I've ever heard. It's usually Christian men are like, we just turned the whole Middle East into a parking lot. Yeah, so you want to kill all kinds of human beings and slaughter children, women, and just kill everyone to turn it into a parking lot. And they say that inside a church. And when Christian men say that, I just want, And usually it's the men in the church saying that who aren't in the military. Usually the ones who say that kind of nonsense. But okay. No, it's not time for men to act like that they're, some action hero in a movie calling for the slaughter of millions of people. When you turn a country into a parking lot, what do you have to do? Destroy everything there, and what are you taking? Human lives, okay? So we can't act that way, all right? Now, the criteria are split into two groups. Remember, there's a criteria that has to be met? This criteria is broken into two categories or two groups, all right? Group number one, or category number one, the right to go to war. First, you have to determine, is it just and right to go to war? Does that make sense? Is it just or right to go? So whenever there's a conflict, like we got a conflict developing right now. So what question should you be asking as a Christian? Is this just and right for us to get into a war with Iran? You've got to ask that question. Right? Second, the second category is right conduct in the war. First, you got to determine, is it just to go? And then you got to determine, is it just and right in the way we are carrying it out and fighting it? Now, typically, the people who bring this up will be accused of being liberals, and you don't want us to win the war because you're trying to tie our hands, and you want us to treat the enemy in a certain way. And usually those kind of people are mocked as being liberal, and they don't really want to win the war because people are looking at it not from a just war perspective. Whenever I say, well, I think that's wrong that we did, when we were taking people off the battleground, taking them to Guantanamo Bay and not giving them any legal right to defend themselves or even prove if they're a terrorist and just holding them indefinitely with no way to prove anything, I called that into question and immediately I get attacked. You're just a liberal and you don't want us to win a war. Or maybe because I'm supposed to be thinking about this from a moral perspective. I hate when the reaction always is from some Christians is if you don't agree with their nationalistic pro-war perspective, you're a liberal and you don't want us to win. I'm like, well, maybe I'm a Christian. Okay, it makes me so mad when Christians, because anytime I bring this up, you should see my email. I get attacked all kinds of ways, and it's like, it drives me crazy that people do that. So these two categories. The first concern is the morality of going to war, and the second is the moral conduct within war. All right? Okay? Now, some say that there should be a third category, and the third category is the post-war settlement and reconstruction. After we fight a war, what's our moral responsibility after the war is over? Okay? In other words, we go in and destroy a country. Do we have a moral obligation to rebuild it? Right? And this raises lots of questions, okay? Others say, nope, who cares? We go in, we kill everything, we just leave it. Others like, no, we have a moral responsibility. But that moral responsibility leads to billions and trillions and zillions of dollars being spent, right? How do you do that? If you're going to spend billions and zillions and trillions putting back a country you just bombed into oblivion, right? Well, wait a minute, we could put billions and zillions and trillions into our country. That's a nationalistic way of approaching it, right? Hey, us first, forget them. Well, wait, what's the moral responsibility? Well, we went to war with them. Well, why did we go to war with them? These are major moral questions that have to be answered. All right? Okay? Now, just war theory basically states that war, while terrible, but less so with the right conduct, is not always the worst option. Important responsibilities, undesirable outcomes, or preventable atrocities may justify war. Right? So just war theory says war is terrible. It can be less so with the right conduct. It's not always the worst option. Important responsibilities, undesirable outcomes, or preventable atrocities may justify war. Just war theory is saying war is not a good thing and it's terrible, but sometimes it may be the only thing that can be done. All right? Now, let's do this. Oh man, we're going to have to use the next hour. I didn't really want to use the next hour for this, but we may have to, okay? Because this is complicated. Here's what I want you to do, all right? We got a few minutes left. Now I'm going to put you on the spot here, all right? You can work together, you can talk to one another, and you can use any electronic device you can find. Find me a biblical verse that you would use to support war. Find a Bible verse that you would use to support war, because I know many of you support war. I've heard people here support war. Now, if you're going to support it, what Bible verse would you use to support it? Now, and remember, I'm only asking you to defend what you've already supported, so you should already have you should already know what verse you would use to support it. Start looking, start talking. See how many of y'all can find one. Just one verse. That's all you need. Actually, you probably need more, but that's okay. I'm going to be interested to see. Nothing? Well, if there's nothing to do it, so then how did the just war theory develop? Telling me they developed a theory with no biblical basis? Can I agree that everyone in here has supported war in the past? Okay, all right. So everybody has, right? Yes? Okay, well then you didn't have a biblical reason to do so? Okay, nationalism. Okay, that's probably being more honest. It probably was more nationalistic driven than it was biblically driven. That's probably true. Yes? Okay. Okay. All right. Now, what Miss Gussler did is she went back to the Old Testament, for those who are listening online who didn't hear what she said, and there's definitely a situation where God told Israel to go in and kill every man, woman, boy, girl, child, and take the land. So that is at least a situation where war was commanded. Right? Now, we would not want to obviously take that passage and apply it to our because that's what we do sometimes with Muslims. We'll take a passage from the Quran and say, look, it calls for killing everyone. Well, it called for killing for everyone. We would believe that was limited to what? Believe that was limited to Israel in that particular time. But that would at least seem to make an argument that God at least allows for war in certain circumstances because he commanded it there. All right, we wouldn't want to use that clearly if we went in and started killing every man, woman, boy, girl to take land. I hope most Christians would condemn said situation. Okay, but yeah, all right. That would be used to build a case. It wouldn't be the best argument, but it would be one to build the case. Mm-hmm. Well, that wasn't necessarily a war, but violence was ordered to punish all those who committed wrong. Okay, not necessarily the best argument for war, but for a command for violence. Who? Yeah, David fought wars. Yes, Solomon didn't, but David, yes. Okay, definitely the kings were engaged in conflict. Yes, there's no question. Now, in some cases when the Bible describes war, it doesn't do so in a prescriptive way. It is only doing in a descriptive way. Sometimes it's only describing what the kings were doing, engaging. It doesn't give a moral judgment of said war. Would everyone agree with that? Okay. All right. Nobody has a better, anything else? Now, I'm going to get 500 emails with 900 verses, but I'm giving y'all the opportunity to be first. They're going to be like, well, if they can't come up with a verse, let me give you mine. Okay. All right. Trust me, I'll get plenty today. Carry out war. Well, I mean, unless you've got a verse to argue for you to carry out war. Okay. There's an important verse in Romans about government. Something about the sword. If you look up sword in a concordance and find how it's used in Romans, you probably will find it. Nobody knows the passage I'm thinking of? We use it to usually use it to support capital punishment. Romans 13:4. What does Romans 13:4 tell us?
For he is the minister of God to thee for good, that if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, and is delivered to wrath upon whom he is evil.
All right, here we go. All right, that's Romans 13:4. All right. If you read Romans chapter 13, starting in verse 1, speaks of being submissive to the powers appointed, governmental powers that are appointed by God. Everybody see that in Romans 13:1? All right. Whoever resisted that power resisted the ordinance of God. Everybody see that? And received themselves damnation. All right. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Now, that's not always true, but it's giving a simple point. All right. And then verse 4, speaking of this governmental power that's appointed by God, the minister, for he, speaking of this governmental power, is the minister of God to thee for good, but if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. Well, having a sword is the idea of what? An instrument of punishment, of death, or of war. All right? And he doesn't bear the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Everybody see that? All right, now here's how the just war doctrine would take this. The government, therefore, has a moral responsibility to go after that which is evil or wrong. Now, we would argue the government's not to go after it from a theological perspective, but in other words, if atrocities are being committed, innocent people are being slaughtered, then the government would execute that sword to punish those and to stop those who are carrying out the evil and the killing and slaughtering and taking of people's land, etc., 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 etc. All right? Now, governments have not, sometimes our government has used the sword in all kinds of different ways. But for example, most would argue World War II, even though we did not want to get involved and it was Pearl Harbor that got us involved, while we were allowing Hitler to do his thing. Once we got involved, right, and we stopped Hitler, we would argue that that was the correct use of the sword. Yes? I mean, because he was exterminating a whole race of people. Yes? All right, so most would agree. That seemed a little bit more black and white. Yes? Right? Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Right? Now, we could argue, should we have dropped atomic weapons on civilian populations? Okay? Right? Was that right or was that wrong? Now, some would argue, well, we had to have dropped the atomic weapons on the civilian populations to bring them to the end. The only other option was us to invade Japan with a ground force, which would have resulted in the slaughter of who knows how many millions of people. So how do you justify that? How do you look at that? Does that make sense? But this would be a verse that at least gives us the basic idea that the government does have a sword and it can exercise that sword in the taking and stopping of evil. That's one of the bases of the just war theory. Does that make sense? But whose power does it put it into? Hands of the government. Now, obviously, people have to fight said war. Right? People have to fight said war. All right, that's... Okay, what verse would you use to argue that we should not go to war? Is there a verse you would use about not going to war? What verse would you use about not going to war? Anybody? Okay. When Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, what did he tell us to do with our enemies? Love our enemies. What did he tell us to do? Do good to them that persecute us and would use us. What else? Turn the other cheek. Resist not evil. That's a very pacifistic message, is it not? And Christianity has a history of pacifists, not American evangelicals. I don't believe in that. But historic Christianity believed in a pacifistic approach. What else? There's a very important commandment. Thou shalt not kill. In fact, that is the entire basis of the major section in the Catholic Catechism dealing with just war is a teaching. In fact, if I go back to the section and the Catechism, Article 5, the fifth commandment. And here they talk about respect for human life. They talk about intentional homicide, abortion, euthanasia, respect for the person in scientific research, respect for bodily integrity. They talk about respect for the dead, safeguarding peace, and avoiding war. And it's all based off, thou shalt not kill. That is a very important scripture. And there's been plenty of Christians throughout history have struggled with that. The Bible says, thou shalt not kill. How can I go to war and kill people? Right? Thou shalt not kill. Right? Okay. Is a drone strike blowing someone to pieces? Exactly. Okay. But I'm saying that thou shalt not kill, even if we translate it murder, it still raises lots of questions on when, how. It still raises lots of questions. So you see, you got two opposite sides. Okay, let's do this to conclude. In the Bible, we have two competing ideas, right? We got more than two, but let's summarize them this way. Yeah. The Bible seems to give the authority to government to carry out what? The use of the sword. Yes? The Bible at the same time calls us as individuals to do what? Love our enemy, turn the other cheek, resist not evil. Yes? And it's hard to imagine loving your enemy while shooting them. Would everyone agree that would seem kind of complicated? I love you, pop, 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 pop. But I love you. Agreed? That seems kind of contrary? Yes? Okay. All right. So, love, right? Sword. We got two competing ideas. The Bible also tells us that we are not to kill. Now, we can get into an argument about how to translate the Hebrew word, but thou shalt not kill. Right. Yeah, he definitely didn't tell them not to be soldiers. That is true. Now, I don't know if we want to base our theology on John the Baptist, but yeah, I mean, definitely he did not tell them not to be. But if you think about it, Jesus and none of the disciples or apostles ever made political statements. Correct? They never got into a political matter, because that would have been a political matter. Yeah, they never really got into that. They usually avoided it. But okay, so we have that. What else do we? So we have thou shalt not kill, love. What else do we have? Thou shalt not kill. Right? We got three. You got those three things. Like you could kind of put a little chart here. The sword, love, thou shalt not kill. What else do we have? Think of from a Christian perspective. What else do we have? Do we believe human life is sacred? We claim to, right? Right? The sanctity of human life. Do we not believe in the sanctity of human life? We typically preach the sanctity of human life when the baby's in the womb, not so much when it comes out of the womb. In the womb, sanctity of life. Outside the womb, kill. Okay? Well, wait a minute. How do we balance that? Yes, we're pro-life, but we're pro-war. I've always found that the most pro-life people are sometimes the most pro-war and pro-gun. Sometimes that's kind of confusing to me, okay? All right? What else do we have? There's one major element here. So what do we have? If you have a piece of paper, you may want to write these out. We got the sword, yes, love of enemy, thou shalt not kill, sanctity of life, and one other big thing that has to come into the play for the Christian. Oh, come on. There's one major thing that should absolutely influence your thinking on this. Everyone in this room claims, as far as I know, to believe in the Bible, correct? And the Bible states the second a person stops breathing, they enter into heaven or hell. So the killing of any individual sends them where? To eternity. You can't forget that. You can't forget that. Right? Sometimes it blows my mind. America will launch some kind of strike and then it'll be, in a church. Yay! I'm like, we're celebrating the death of human beings who just entered into heaven or hell? I think it would be a time to mourn and to weep. I don't think it'd be a time to celebrate. Because I thought we didn't want anyone to go to hell, right? Or is that just something we say on the brochure? If we don't like them, then we don't care if they go to hell. I have a hard time with that. You kill someone, they go into eternity. Like, I'm not just making a decision about their present, I'm making a decision about their eternity. Well, I'm making this decision to send them there, right? If I pull the gun and I pull it, I'm making a decision. Now, God may be sovereign, but I'm still making the decision to pull the trigger. And when I pull that trigger and their life ends, what happens? And who and you can say God is sovereign, but then who was being used in the situation to send them there? I was, all right? So God's sovereignty does not negate man's responsibility, right? Who got blamed did not, when God made it very clear in the book of Acts that evil hands are the things that led to the crucifixion of Christ. He didn't say, hey, I sovereignly planned the crucifixion of Christ, so the people who put him on the cross bear no responsibility. That's never the biblical approach. God may be sovereign, but who's still responsible? Humans, right? We can't negate that. That goes to an extreme form of sovereignty. No, man is still responsible. Because by that thing, anything I do, I'm not responsible, correct? And go back there and punch the Dazzler twins 3 times in the face. Hey, it's not me who did it. Or maybe I should use that. I could punch them, okay? I think everybody here would be like, no, you're responsible. Yes? So everybody just say, I got to consider eternity into my thinking, right? I don't know how it all plays out, but those are a lot of things. So let's go through them again. What's on the one side? Sword. Love. Thou shalt not kill. The sanctity of life. Eternity. That's a lot of factors to put together, right? It's a lot of factors. I look at a situation, I'm like, okay, well, government has the right here. Well, wait a minute. We're supposed to love our enemy. Okay, how do I balance that? Wait a minute. Sanctity of life. Oh, wait a minute. Thou shalt not kill. Wait a minute. Eternity. Those are 5. Now, to try to take those kind of positions together and put them together, can you see how complicated this can be? See why there's not always going to be agreement? Yes. But what must we strive to do? To end this hour, what's the thing we have to strive to do as Christians? We have to strive our best to not think of it from a purely legalistic perspective, a strategic perspective, a political perspective, or a nationalistic perspective. You have a responsibility to think about what's going on in your world from a biblical, theological perspective. When it comes to the subject of war, the just war doctrine comes in to say, hey, here's how you should look at it. Now, you probably couldn't even articulate the points of the just war doctrine, and we're going to have to look at each point and try to understand this carefully. But this is a serious subject, and we'll put this back together in the next hour, all right? Let's stop right there and pray. Lord God, we come before you this morning. Lord, our world right now is facing some serious situations. We have no idea how this is going to play out. It may just turn out to be nothing for now, then turn out to be something serious moving forward. We do not know. But I know this, that whatever occurs, if it's escalation, if it's war, if it's just a armed conflict in that region, human lives will be caught in the middle. There will be civilians caught in the middle who don't take a side, but their lives will be wiped out. Their children's lives may be taken from them. And there'll be those who are ordered by their government to fight in an armed conflict, and their lives will be in danger, and they will lose their lives. The loss of human life should be something that no Christian celebrates or rejoices in. We do acknowledge that at times it is necessary, but it's not something we should rejoice in, and I pray that we would spend time praying for all those involved, praying for the leaders of all the countries involved, and that obviously we pray for peace, we pray for the end of conflict, and we pray for the protection of all human life. And I pray that that would be our desire above all else. And we ask this in Jesus' name. And God's people said,